I never expected the HOA's illegal bridge across my property would be my ticket to millions, turning their power play into my ultimate victory. What would you do if your neighbor's invasion of your land suddenly became your path to financial freedom? I never imagined I'd wake up one morning and find my own land under siege. Yet there I was, standing barefoot in my backyard, coffee forgotten in my hand, watching a group of workers drive stakes into the soft earth. My earth. The land I had painstakingly fought for. The land that was supposed to be mine alone. I wasn't the type to cause a scene, but something inside me snapped. I marched toward the workers, my voice firm but steady. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing?" One of them barely glanced up. "Bridge project, ma'am." HOA approved. Bridge project? HOA. My stomach tightened. I hadn't approved anything. That's when I spotted her, Veronica Lancaster, the impeccably dressed HOA president, standing at the property line, clipboard in hand. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're trespassing," I said, my voice sharp. "Oh, Simone," she cooed, feigning innocence. "The board approved it last month. It was all in the newsletter." I had never received a newsletter. And even if I had, no piece of paper gave them the right to steal from me. I took a breath. This wasn't over. I gripped the cease and desist letter in my trembling hands as I stormed toward the construction site the next morning. My heart pounded with frustration, each step crunching against the gravel like the grinding of my teeth. I had spent all night combing through my property documents, highlighting every boundary, every legal claim to the land where these trespassers were hammering away like it was theirs. But the rage truly boiled over when I saw Veronica Lancaster standing there again, her arms folded, a smug smirk curling at the edges of her perfectly glossed lips. "This has to stop, now." My voice carried over the hum of machinery, but she didn't even flinch. "Oh, Simone," she sighed as if I were a misbehaving child rather than the rightful owner of this land. "We've been over this. The board made a decision for the good of the community. You're the only one making this difficult." I thrust the letter at her, my patience fraying. "You didn't get my permission. You don't have the right." "Technically, we do." She cut me off, her tone as smooth as silk. "The HOA has an easement claim that allows us to make necessary improvements." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. "Improvements? You're driving concrete posts into my land without my consent." I turned to the nearest worker, who had paused to watch the commotion. "You're all trespassing, and if you don't stop right now, I'll have the sheriff out here before lunch." That seemed to rattle some of them. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but Veronica remained composed, twirling a pen between her fingers. "Oh, Simone, let's not get legal. That could be expensive for you." I clenched my fists, my breath coming fast. Was that a threat? My jaw tightened. They thought they could bully me into submission. I looked at the half-built foundation, the steel beams arriving on a flatbed truck. They wanted a war. Fine. They'd get one. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing my kitchen, my mind racing with every possible move. My laptop sat open on the table, tabs filled with property law statutes, local zoning ordinances, and contact information for attorneys. Every few minutes, I'd glance at the cease and desist letter I had served Veronica, my anger simmering under the surface like a volcano ready to blow. The audacity. The sheer arrogance. They thought I would roll over and accept it, that I'd let them take what was mine without a fight. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. A knock at my door startled me. When I pulled it open, my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, stood there, holding a plate of samosas. Her expression was tense, her lips pressed together. "I saw what happened earlier," she said, stepping inside. "The HOA thinks they can do whatever they want. You're not the first person they've steamrolled." I blinked. You mean? She nodded gravely, setting the plate on my table. They fined my husband and me for our fence last year. Said the color didn't meet aesthetic standards. It was the same white paint we'd had for 10 years. I exhaled sharply. Let me guess, more fines followed. She sighed. $500 for a landscaping violation. Then another $700 for a non-conforming walkway. The stress nearly put my husband in the hospital. She lowered her voice. We had to sell. Veronica's real estate group helped us find a buyer. The pieces clicked into place. They were forcing people out. I grabbed my laptop, scrolling through the property records I'd been digging into. Sure enough, multiple homes in the neighborhood had sold to the same LLC tied to Veronica's firm. This isn't just about my land, I muttered. This is a pattern. Mrs. Patel nodded. And you might be the first person standing up to them. A slow determination settled over me. I had been thinking of this as a battle for my property. But it was bigger than me. Veronica Lancaster had been playing dirty for years. And now, I had proof. I sat in my car across from the HOA office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sun had long set, casting eerie shadows across the building's pristine facade. I wasn't just here for answers, I was here for proof. Proof that Veronica Lancaster and her HOA board had been running a quiet, calculated scheme to force homeowners out, and proof that I wasn't just another victim waiting for my turn to be pushed off my own land. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. This wasn't a reckless move. I had a plan. Earlier that day, Mrs. Patel had given me a tip. Her friend, Henry Wilkes, used to be on the HOA board before suddenly resigning. He might know something. And he was waiting for me inside. I stepped out of the car and approached the building. The place was supposed to be closed, but a single light glowed through the blinds of Veronica's office. My pulse quickened. Was she still inside? Watching? I reached the entrance and tried the handle, locked. Just as I was about to text Henry, the door creaked open from the inside. He was older than I expected, his gray hair disheveled, his glasses slipping down his nose. His expression was cautious. Simone, right? He whispered, glancing over his shoulder before motioning me inside. You have no idea how dangerous this is. I followed him in, my heart pounding as he led me to a small office in the back. Papers were scattered across the desk. He dug through them, finally pulling out a thick folder. This, he hesitated, pressing it into my hands. This is what they don't want you to see. I flipped it open. My stomach dropped. Inside were records, emails, signed documents, financial transactions. Homeowners had been fined relentlessly, bullied into selling at a fraction of market value. Then, Veronica's company swept in, scooping up properties for pennies. I looked up at Henry, my breath unsteady. Why are you giving this to me? He exhaled, rubbing his temples. Because I stayed quiet too long. And now, they're finally going to get what they deserve. I didn't sleep that night. The folder Henry had given me sat on my kitchen table, daring me to open it again. Every page was a confession, a roadmap of corruption that had been unfolding right under everyone's noses. Veronica Lancaster and her HOA board weren't just fining people into submission, they were systematically forcing homeowners out, scooping up properties through shell companies, and reselling them at enormous profit. They had turned our neighborhood into their personal ATM, and no one had stopped them. Until now. I sat down, flipping through the documents again. Names of residents I recognized appeared on eviction notices, foreclosure filings, and sales records, all tied to suspiciously low purchase prices. Mr. Grayson, the retired teacher 2 doors down, had lost his home last year after unpaid fines stacked up to $12,000. But according to these records, his payments had been misallocated to another account. Another name caught my eye, Sophia Jenkins, the single mom I sometimes ran into at the park. Her house was on this list too, sold at half its value just 2 months ago. My stomach churned. It was one thing to suspect something shady. It was another to see it in black and white. Then I saw my own name. A cold chill ran through me as I read the fine print. My property had been flagged for compliance review, a fancy term for their next target. The projected sale price of my home was already listed, along with an estimated timeline for acquisition, 3 months. I gripped the edge of the table, my vision blurring with rage. They weren't just harassing me. They had already decided I would lose. That I would fold like the others, pack up my life, and hand my home over for their next real estate scheme. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. If I was going down, I wasn't going down alone. By morning, I was meeting with a lawyer. By noon, I was rallying the neighbors. And by nightfall, I had a plan to bring the entire HOA empire crashing down around Veronica Lancaster's smug, scheming smile. I stood at the front of my packed living room, looking at the faces of my neighbors, people who had been bullied, threatened, and financially drained by Veronica Lancaster's HOA empire. Some sat with arms crossed, hesitant, still afraid of the woman who had ruled over them for years. Others leaned forward, hungry for a solution, for justice. I felt their exhaustion, but I also saw something else in their eyes, hope. I know some of you are scared, I began, my voice steady but firm. You've been told you have no choice but to follow the rules. That fighting back will only make things worse. But what if I told you that the HOA has been breaking the law this entire time? That they've stolen from us, manipulated records, and forced people out of their homes for their own gain? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Henry, the former HOA treasurer who had handed me the evidence, stepped forward. Simone is right, he said, holding up one of the damning documents. I kept copies of everything. HOA fees have been funneled into private accounts. Homes have been targeted and seized under false pretenses. And look at these signatures, half of them are forged. A sharp gasp came from the corner where Mrs. Jenkins sat clutching a folder filled with her own collection of fines and notices. I knew it, she whispered, her voice shaking. I knew something wasn't right. I looked around the room, catching the eyes of every person who had suffered under Veronica's rule. We have the evidence. We have legal grounds to fight back. But we have to do this together. If we go public, if we demand an investigation, if we refuse to let them bully us any longer, we win. A heavy silence followed, then one by one, heads nodded. A hand shot up. Tell us what to do. My heart pounded, but I forced a calm smile. Tomorrow, we take this to the county board, to the news, to the courts. We aren't just fighting back, we're taking back our community. And for the first time in years, the people of Willow Creek had something stronger than fear. They had justice on their side. I stepped into the county records office, the stale scent of old paper and printer ink filling the air. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as I approached, her glasses sliding down her nose as she shuffled through a pile of documents. Hi, I'm Simone Carter. I'm here to pull public records for Willow Creek Estates HOA. The woman sighed, clearly unimpressed. And what exactly are you looking for? I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough to catch her attention. Property ownership records, financial reports, board meeting minutes, and any land use changes in the past 5 years. That got her attention. She set down her papers and adjusted her glasses, finally meeting my eyes. That's a lot of information. Most people just request 1 or 2 documents. You're digging for something, aren't you? I gave her a tight smile. Let's just say I have a feeling there's something worth finding. She nodded slowly, tapping her nails against the counter before getting up and disappearing behind the rows of filing cabinets. Minutes passed. My fingers drummed against my leg as I glanced at the security camera in the corner. Suspense hung in the air like an overcast storm. Finally, she returned, dropping a thick folder onto the desk between us. "You didn't hear this from me," she muttered, lowering her voice. "But something isn't right with your HOA. Their financial reports are all over the place, and look at this." She flipped to a page and pointed to a deed transfer. My stomach clenched as I read the names. The HOA hadn't just been harassing homeowners with fines. They had been quietly seizing properties under fraudulent claims of unpaid dues, then transferring ownership to a development company. A company owned by none other than Veronica Lancaster's husband. I inhaled sharply, my hands gripping the folder. This is fraud. This is theft. The clerk looked over her shoulder and leaned in. It's more than that. Keep looking. My pulse thundered as I flipped through page after page of damning evidence. The truth wasn't just bad, it was explosive. And Veronica had no idea what was coming next. The Willow Creek Estates HOA board gathered for their monthly meeting, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Veronica Lancaster, draped in her signature red blazer, tapped her manicured nails against the table as she glanced over the agenda. She was ready to flex her power, ready to shut down any homeowner concerns with legal jargon and passive-aggressive smiles. But tonight was different. I stepped into the room, a file in one hand and my phone recording in the other. Conversations quieted. Homeowners who had once whispered in fear now watched with anticipation. I walked to the front, placing the thick folder onto the table before Veronica. "Before we begin, I'd like to discuss some irregularities with HOA finances," I said, my voice smooth but firm. Veronica scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Simone, unless you've finally decided to pay your fines, I don't see why you're here." I smiled. "I'm here because you've been stealing homes." Gasps rippled through the room. Veronica's smug expression faltered. I flipped open the file, pulling out deed transfers, fraudulent fines, and records of properties quietly shifted to Lancaster Development, the same company owned by her husband. I lifted my phone, projecting my screen onto the HOA's projector. "Every homeowner in this room has been targeted," I continued, scrolling through emails I'd uncovered, emails proving that fines had been strategically placed on specific houses to pressure homeowners into selling. I turned to face the crowd. "Margaret Jenkins. You lost your home over a $900 fine for unapproved flower pots. Miguel and Sophia. They were threatened with liens over a toy left in their yard. And here's the best part, none of it was legal." Veronica's face paled. She reached for the folder, but I slammed my hand down, stopping her. "The county has these records now. The district attorney, too. You didn't just break the rules, Veronica. You broke the law." The room erupted. Homeowners shouted, standing, their fear turning to fury. And Veronica? For the first time, she was speechless. Poetic justice had arrived. And it had my name all over it. The fallout from the meeting was immediate and brutal. Veronica Lancaster, once the untouchable queen of Willow Creek Estates, had lost her grip on the neighborhood overnight. The homeowners who once cowered under her iron rule were now out for blood, and I had given them the ammunition they needed. The next morning, I walked outside to find a crowd gathered in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, passing around copies of the documents I had exposed. Veronica's fraudulent property acquisitions, the manipulated fines, the backdoor deals with her husband's development company, it was all out in the open now. "She's finished," Miguel muttered beside me, shaking his head. "They're already talking about removing her from the board." I watched as cars rolled up to Veronica's house, one after another. First, a team of county auditors, escorted by 2 uniformed officers. Then, a crew from the local news station, cameras in hand, ready to film the downfall of the most corrupt HOA president our town had ever seen. Veronica didn't come outside, but I knew she was watching from behind her designer curtains, powerless for the first time in years. By the afternoon, the HOA board called an emergency vote. This time, there was no intimidation, no manipulation. Homeowners, armed with the truth, stood tall as they cast their ballots. The decision was unanimous. Veronica was officially removed as president. As I stood outside her house, watching as a legal representative served her with an official notice of investigation, a sense of satisfaction settled deep in my chest. She had built her empire on fear and deceit, believing that no one would ever challenge her. But she had underestimated the power of the people she had oppressed for so long. As I walked back to my house, I passed by Eleanor, one of the women who had once supported Veronica. She hesitated before speaking, then finally whispered, "Thank you, Simone. For standing up for all of us." I nodded, smiling slightly. The war wasn't over yet, but this battle was mine. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Standing at the front of the packed community center, I felt the weight of the past months pressing against me, the frustration, the fear, the fights. But tonight, it all came to a head. The people of Willow Creek Estates weren't just here for another HOA meeting, they were here to take back their neighborhood. Veronica Lancaster, the former queen of the HOA, sat stiffly in the front row, her once polished demeanor cracking under the pressure of the dozens of eyes burning into her. The investigation into her financial misdeeds had exposed a tangled web of fraud, and her empire was crumbling. The HOA's lawyer had already confirmed that every unjust fine, every fabricated rule, and every backroom deal was being reversed. "The board has reached a decision," Ted, the interim HOA president, announced. "All pending fines issued under Veronica Lancaster's tenure are hereby dismissed. Any funds collected through fraudulent means will be returned in full." The room erupted into cheers. People clapped, neighbors hugged, and I felt a swell of triumph so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. I scanned the crowd, seeing faces that had once looked defeated now filled with hope. Veronica stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," she shrieked. "You can't just erase years of work." Ted barely glanced at her. "Years of corruption," he corrected. "You built your power on intimidation, Veronica. But tonight, the community is reclaiming what's theirs." She stormed out, shoving past the news crew that had arrived to document her downfall. I watched her go, knowing she'd never hold power here again. As the meeting wrapped up, I stepped outside to a warm breeze and the sound of neighbors laughing, real laughter, not the nervous, hushed kind that used to fill these meetings. Eleanor, who had once blindly followed Veronica's rule, approached me with a genuine smile. "We were wrong about you, Simone," she said. "You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us." I smiled, breathing in the sweet air of victory. The HOA had tried to bury me, but instead, I had risen, and I had won. The sun was setting behind the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates as I stood on my porch, watching neighbors gather outside the community center. It had been weeks since the old HOA board crumbled under the weight of their own corruption, but tonight was the final piece of closure, an election for a new, fair leadership, one that truly represented the people. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back, wanting to observe before stepping into the conversation. The energy in the room was different now, no longer tense, no longer filled with fear. There was laughter, handshakes, a shared sense of relief that the worst was behind us. People who had once whispered in hushed voices about fines and intimidation now spoke freely, openly discussing ideas for the neighborhood's future. Ted, the interim president, stepped up to the microphone. "All right, folks," he said, "tonight, we make things official. It's time to vote for our new HOA board." Names were read, ballots were passed out, and the votes were cast. I wasn't running, I never wanted a seat of power. But what I had wanted, what I had fought for, was happening right in front of me. A community was reclaiming itself. As the last votes were counted, a cheer erupted. Sarah, the same woman who once hesitated to question Veronica's rule, had been elected president. Miguel, the single dad who nearly lost his home over unjust fines, was now the treasurer. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who was once threatened with a lien for planting daisies instead of approved HOA flowers, had won a board seat by a landslide. The room filled with applause, and Sarah took the microphone, her voice steady and strong. No more secret rules. No more bullying. From now on, this HOA serves the people, not the other way around. I felt something shift in the air, a tangible weight lifting from the shoulders of the neighborhood. As I turned to leave, Ted caught my arm. "You did this, Simone," he said quietly. I shook my head with a smile. "No," I replied, glancing back at the cheering room. "We all did." The night of the community block party, Willow Creek Estates felt like it had been reborn. String lights crisscrossed the streets, casting a warm glow over the newly revitalized neighborhood. The scent of grilled burgers and fresh-baked desserts filled the air as laughter echoed through the cul-de-sac. Children rode their bikes freely, their parents chatting without the worry of a fine arriving in the mail the next morning. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't divided by petty rules or threats, they were united. Near the park entrance, a newly placed sign gleamed under the lights, "Willow Creek Community Park, a space for all." Below, in smaller letters, it read, "Established 2025, made possible by the residents of Willow Creek Estates." Seeing my own name among those who had helped fight for this moment nearly brought tears to my eyes. Sarah, our newly elected HOA president, stood on the community center steps, microphone in hand. "For too long, this neighborhood was ruled by fear," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "But tonight, we celebrate what happens when people stand together. When we refuse to be bullied. When we fight not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors." A wave of applause followed, some people even cheering. I looked around at the faces in the crowd, Mrs. Jenkins smiling beside her thriving flower garden, Miguel flipping burgers with his kids helping, even former doubters like Eleanor joining in. This wasn't just a victory over corruption. It was a victory of community, of resilience, of people reclaiming their power. As music played and people danced under the lights, I exhaled, finally at peace. We had won, not just against the HOA, but for each other.